Hello, 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 and welcome to the latest Lace Partners HR on the Offensive Live. It's me, Chris Howard from Lace Partners, back again and joining me once again for your second time. This is not your first rodeo. It's they're back, the duet, which is Andy Brown from Engage and Pete Thomas from Team Fit. How you guys doing? All right?
Well, good, yeah, not too bad.
Thank you.
So, wanted to grab you guys, maybe spend 5-10 minutes, just have a bit of a chat around team coaching, because this is something that obviously you guys are specialists in, and I think it's quite an interesting one. And the angle that we've got today, particularly from a HR lens, is looking at the benefits of team coaching, because I think a lot of organizations think about coaching from an individual mentoring one-to-one perspective. I've done team coaching as a collective, but just pulling out some of those benefits, maybe having a chat about that, and also with a HR lens as well, because I think there's an element of, we've called today's live stream practicing what you preach, because I find it quite interesting that HR as an entity spends a lot of time looking at the rest of the business. How can you help support line managers, people from a variety of different areas from a people function perspective, but the coaching side, which they will of course be extolling the virtues of, perhaps they do a little bit less, but we'll come to that in a second. Let's sort of do a bit of a framing exercise, if that's all right. And I'll start with you, Andy, and then get your views on this, Pete. Just talk to me a little bit around why it's important and what it is exactly.
Yeah, so I think that why it's important is vital. So what do we know? We know the vast majority of people work in teams. So you get different estimates, but 8% plus of people who work in business work in a team.
Yeah.
So it's the unit that drives performance. And we know from data, there was a piece from Bain & Co in Harvard Business Review last week saying that high performing teams, particularly at the top of organisations, drive 3 times the volumes of profit, revenue growth, and total shareholder return. So it has huge business benefits if you get teams right. But only about 12% of teams are high performing.
Okay.
It's a pretty stark statistic.
Yeah.
Hence our focus on team coaching. And it's a very different approach to the individual coaching that you were talking about. I don't know, Pete, do you want to talk through, you've created a whole methodology around team coaching. Do you want to talk through a bit of how we tackle it?
Yeah, I mean, like most things, you start with a diagnostic. And that diagnostic can take many different forms. You can do 360, you can do interviews, you can do it actually in the room with people. And I've used all 3. But the critical thing is to get the team to decide what's the trigger, what's the thing they want to work on, which will make the biggest difference. It doesn't have to be the thing that actually they score the lowest, but what is the thing that at the moment, we're doing a transformation. So maybe what's important at the moment is this element of team fundamental, rather than something that was in business as usual. So that can change. But the team, once you do diagnostic, you feed that back and they discuss it and they decide what's important, you then have their engagement. Now, different from team development that I think traditionally has been done, when you get people in a room and half the people don't really want to be there. Right? I mean, we've all been in those sessions. Yeah. Whereas from minute one on this one, they've decided. I mean, I always say, it's your agenda. You've decided this. And then after that, you work through those bits and say, well, okay, so what do you need to do differently? Let's understand why it's an issue or it's a challenge for you, what you need to do differently, and let's get some commitments and some action that you can take individually, but also collectively to work on that. And it's an ongoing process. And that's the point. When you're trying to change habits and routines, I will talk about habits and routine. That doesn't happen overnight. It takes 67 days to change a habit. So.
Okay. And in terms of outcomes, benefits, and how that kind of manifests itself, can you talk to me a little bit around some of those benefits that you guys have seen when you've been speaking to large teams, high performance teams? Yeah.
So Pete and I, when we talk about the work we've done in team coaching, I think it goes from everything from big, juicy topics like what is the purpose of the team. You can start to create clarity of that. Lots of teams form, exist, meet. They don't actually sit back and say, why are we here? So you can go from really deep stuff like that, other deep things like, what should we be focusing our time on? What are our priorities for the business? What should we stop doing? So there's bigger issues like that, right through to practical stuff like, how can we make our meetings more effective? How do we want to behave towards each other? What are our ways of working that we're going to agree? How do we, there are nutty topics that they have to tackle, like how do we handle conflict? So there's a huge range, I think, Pete, of the kinds of benefits that it can drive for teams. What I think it does get them to, though, Chris, is, as Pete touched on, it's learning new habits of working in order that the team is effective, and that then drives performance for the business. That's the ultimate outcome. Is that fair?
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think, and again, it depends where the team is.
Yes.
It absolutely depends where the team is. But that's not to say that actually you'd think, okay, so the team's been in place for 4 or 5 years or whatever it is. So they're obviously clear on their purpose. No, not necessarily. You find that majority of teams actually, and funnily enough, research showed the more senior the team, the less likely they are to have a really compelling shared purpose.
Interesting.
So it's quite an interesting conversation to have when they tend to think, yes, we have that. And then when you get into it, no, they haven't.
Yeah.
So that's, that or behavioural stuff, it's all in the mix, really.
And how does that differ? Sorry, go on.
I was going to say it can come from very different sources as well. So we've coached in team format, teams who are newly formed. So how do we come together and work well? We coach teams who have been formed for a while, but aren't performing particularly well. And then we've got teams who might be quite good at performance, but want to marginally improve.
Yeah.
So the source of why they're bringing the team coaching in can differ.
Yeah. Well, you've just answered my question. That was the question I was just going to answer you. The difference between kind of like, you just make that assumption that, we've got a newly forming team that's being embedded, so let's put them through some coaching. But actually, it's something that can be applied regardless of whether or not you are that storming, forming, norming type style. It doesn't matter. It's, there are always benefits to be made.
Yeah.
The top performing teams, that 13%, one of the traits they have is that they improve. They take that as a priority. So they will be looking for a team coach, or they've built such a habit they do it themselves. But the improvement is what their number 1, 2, or 3 priority. You go to other teams that aren't in that top 13, and they do it once a year if you're lucky, right, on a day off, which isn't going to build a routine and habit, because it's just going to be so that's the difference between that. And so it's not, people often think, oh, so what's the problem with the team? It doesn't have to be a problem with the team. As you say, incremental things, and the best teams do that all the time.
Yeah, that continuous evolution. You do that. We're talking about from a team perspective, but if I think about it from an individual perspective as well, like you learn something, you need to continuously evolve. You need to keep learning, you need to keep developing, you need to keep changing things, you need to keep iterating. So I think that's quite.
And it's interesting that from an individuals understand that, right? So people understand that if I go on a training course for a day, I'm going to have to do things afterwards to make that make those learnings come alive. And yet people don't tend to take that same thing with teams. It has to be a coaching approach. It has to be an ongoing approach. Otherwise, things won't change. And it's more complicated with a group of people than an individual, because there's more, behaviours and people's different views, personalities. So it's obviously going to take longer and harder. But the benefits, this 23% you get, outweighs the benefit of an individual's development, which can be up to 6% increase. So 23%. Why would you not do that? Why would you not work on a team?
I think the other thing worth keeping in mind, because you're talking about teams that are kind of evolving, their environment's evolving as well, right? So we work with a lot of teams who are going through big transformation. Once they're facing that transformation head on, their world is very different. So the way they need to lead as a team, how they communicate, how they get people engaged with that change has got to alter as well. Yeah.
Right. Well, we've got about a minute or two left, and I just wanted to pick your brains just to give a few examples, because I think this is quite interesting. We said this in the lead up for this live stream, talking about if we think about from a HR perspective. I've done a couple of podcasts on the HR on the Offensive podcast looking at HR, who looks after HR. And we've talked about it from a mental well-being perspective. We've talked about it from a personal and an individual development perspective. HR professionals spend a lot of time looking outward at the rest of the business. Do they always look inward enough? So I'd be really interested to get your thoughts on this from a HR perspective in terms of how HR, or do HR teams, even in your experience, do they engage with this idea of team coaching? That's probably the first question. If they don't, have you got some examples about some good examples when you've worked on recent assignments of when it's worked well? Andy, I'll start with you.
I mean,
Oh, sorry.
I think we share.
Is that Andy?
what-
Pointed at Pete.
we
wasn't it?
share a common view on this, which is it's a bit cobbler's children.
Right.
So HR probably do this team coaching stuff a little less than other functions in the business.
Yeah.
So we've worked with finance teams, marketing teams, product teams, technology teams who do this relentlessly. HR are probably the least engaged with it. And that may be your point about they're looking after other people in the business. But I think there's a real business case for HR tackling stuff as a team better. And that might be, they could be forming as a new team. It might be they're developing a new people strategy. They may need to develop new ways of working. There could be all sorts of stimuli to that. But I honestly think they need to be embracing team coaching just as much as other functional teams would work with.
Yeah.
Totally agree. Totally. I mean, before I did this, I've worked for 25 years in corporate life, but in HR, in leadership positions. Not once have we got together to talk about the team and, how we can work better together. It's still relatively siloed. And yet, as Andy said, some of the teams that we work with that are similar to HR in terms of like finance, IT, they provide a service. They get huge benefit out of this process. And a lot of that benefit is be really clear what your value is to the business. Right. So going back to what is your purpose and what is the value you bring? And then having those conversations opens up so many new avenues. And I know certainly from an HR perspective, those HR teams that have done well when I've worked with them is because they speak business terms. They speak about the value that they can bring. And I think just doing that with HR teams, say, you need to speak about your value, think about that. Let's work on that so that you build some habits and routines to do that, if nothing else.
Yeah,
that's a real win.
I think that's a really, really important point, actually. And we've talked about that on the HR on the Offensive podcast.
Okay.
We had Catherine Dolan, who was the CPO of Bureau Veritas, talking about how essential it was that she spoke that commercial language to the rest of her C-suite colleagues. And then when you filter that down in terms of a team coaching perspective and getting your HR leadership team to start thinking and talking that commercial language, I think that's really, really important as well. Just before we wrap up today, is there any kind of final thoughts that either of you guys wanted to bring up around sort of team coaching in general, how it's applied to HR?
Yeah, so I think number one, there's got to be a shift away from just doing individual coaching towards team. The benefits, as Pete mentioned earlier, that you see from team coaching approaches are multifold versus the individual interventions that we can do.
Yeah.
From an HR perspective, going back to what we said, I think they should just try it.
Yeah.
Right? They don't try it because, as you say, they're too busy thinking about other people in the business. Why not give it a go? Because I think everybody benefits from it
Absolutely.
whenever we work with them. So
Perfect.
get your toes in the water.
Yeah, well, if you want to reach out to Andy or Pete, if you want to chat with them about team coaching, then what we'll do is we'll pop a link after we release the live stream. But hopefully you've enjoyed it as much as I have. Andy, thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks, Chris.
And Pete, as always, thank you very much.
Nice to see you.
And we'll catch you next time on HR on the Offensive Live. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.